Officer Richard Mercer stands frozen, his police badge falling to the ground as realization dawns. The luxury sedan he vandalized in blind rage belongs to Elijah Wright, the first black FBI director. Sirens wail closer as security footage of his hate-fueled rampage plays on national news. Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? If this kind of justice being served satisfies you, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories where racism faces consequences. How would you react if you discovered your hateful actions had targeted one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country? Let's find out what happened next. The morning of June 12th had begun like any other for Officer Richard Mercer. At 43 years old, the 15-year veteran of the Boston Police Department started his day with the same routine he always followed: black coffee, protein bar, and 30 minutes scrolling through conservative news sites that reinforced his worldview. What his colleagues at the precinct didn't know was that Mercer also spent time on encrypted forums where officers shared racist memes and coordinated harassment of minorities in affluent neighborhoods. Mercer had built what his superiors called a stellar arrest record, but what they conveniently overlooked was the disturbing pattern behind those arrests. 87% of the suspects Mercer brought in were black or Hispanic, despite his patrol area having a majority white population. His personnel file contained 12 complaints of excessive force, all filed by black citizens, all mysteriously dismissed due to lack of evidence or procedural inconsistencies. Captain Thomas Bradshaw had personally intervened in 3 internal affairs investigations targeting Mercer. They had been roommates at the police academy, and Bradshaw knew that Mercer's uncle sat on the police oversight committee. Protecting. Mercer wasn't just about friendship, it was about protecting the system they had built together. That evening, Mercer was off duty but still carrying his service weapon as he arrived at Maison Laurent, one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. He hadn't made a reservation, but flashing his badge usually secured him preferential treatment. He noticed a sleek black Mercedes S-Class with government plates in the reserved parking section as he handed his keys to the valet. "Nice ride," Mercer commented, nodding toward the Mercedes. "Yes, sir," the young valet Miguel replied politely. "Just arrived about 20 minutes ago." As Mercer walked toward the entrance, he spotted a well-dressed black man exiting the vehicle. The man wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, carried a leather briefcase with a distinctive gold emblem, and walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Something about the man's self-assured demeanor triggered an immediate surge of resentment in Mercer. "Must be nice," Mercer muttered under his breath. "Probably some affirmative action hire showing off." Mercer watched as the restaurant staff greeted the man with obvious deference, the maitre d' personally escorting him to a private dining area in the back. The special treatment made Mercer's blood boil. In his mind, this scene violated the natural order of things. Inside the restaurant, Mercer couldn't focus on his meal or his date, a dispatcher from the precinct who quickly realized this evening was a mistake. He kept glancing toward the private dining room, where he could occasionally glimpse the black man engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with 2 other individuals whose faces Mercer couldn't see. "Is everything okay, Richard?" his date asked after he checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "Just peachy," he replied, draining his 3rd scotch. "Just wondering when they started letting anyone with a nice suit into places like this." His date's expression shifted, a flash of discomfort crossing her face. "I should probably head home. Early shift tomorrow." "Fine," Mercer said, barely noticing as she gathered her purse and left without another word. 30 minutes later, after 2 more drinks, Mercer exited the restaurant and headed toward the parking area. The black Mercedes still sat in its reserved spot, gleaming under the decorative lighting. No witnesses were around. The valet had stepped away to retrieve another car, and the security camera above the parking area was partially obscured by decorative foliage. Or so Mercer thought. What began as keying the driver's side door quickly escalated. Mercer pulled out his pocket knife and slashed the 2 nearest tires. The physical release felt good, unleashing the rage he normally kept controlled during working hours. He grabbed a brick from the decorative border of a nearby planter and smashed the driver's side window. Glass sprayed across the leather interior. Mercer reached into his pocket and pulled out a can of black spray paint he had confiscated from a teenager earlier that day. With growing boldness, he sprayed racial slurs across the hood and doors, his face twisted with hatred as he worked. He was so engrossed in his vandalism that he failed to notice the restaurant's security camera on the opposite side of the lot, capturing his every move in high-definition clarity. The camera recorded his face, his badge partially visible on his belt and his department-issued phone when he paused to check a text message. Miguel, the valet, had returned during Mercer's rampage but remained hidden behind a column, recording additional footage on his phone. He immediately recognized Mercer as a police officer, having seen him flash his badge earlier. His hands trembled as he captured the evidence, knowing the risks of documenting a cop committing a crime. Inside the restaurant, Elijah Wright was concluding his confidential meeting with two Justice Department officials regarding a major corruption investigation that had led them to Boston. As FBI director, Wright had built a reputation for methodical, by-the-book operations that left no room for error or appeal when cases went to trial. His career had been dedicated to ensuring that no one, regardless of position or power, was above the law. As Wright signed the check and prepared to leave, Miguel rushed inside and whispered urgently to the manager, who immediately turned pale. The manager approached Wright's table with obvious discomfort. "Sir, I deeply regret to inform you that there's been an incident with your vehicle." Wright followed the manager outside, where he stopped abruptly at the sight of his destroyed car. Racial slurs dripped in still wet paint across the gleaming surface he had polished just yesterday. The slashed tires and shattered window completed the scene of targeted violence. Unlike many men confronted with such a visceral display of hatred, Wright didn't shout or lose his composure. 27 years in law enforcement had taught him that emotional reactions rarely improve difficult situations. Instead, he calmly took out his phone and made a single call. "This is Director Wright," he said, his voice steady. "I need a security detail and forensic team at Maison Laurent restaurant downtown Boston. No sirens, no lights. Yes, it's a priority one situation." As he ended the call, Miguel approached cautiously, his phone held out. "Sir, I got everything on video," he said, his voice shaking. "The man who did this, he's a cop. I saw his badge earlier when he came in." Wright's expression remained unchanged, but something hardened in his eyes. "Thank you, son," he said, placing a hand briefly on Miguel's shoulder. "You've done the right thing. Would you be willing to send me that footage right now?" As Miguel forwarded the video, Wright made a second call, this one to the Boston Police Commissioner directly. His voice remained professional, but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "Commissioner Daniels, this is FBI Director Wright. We need to talk about one of your officers." The Boston Police Department headquarters erupted into chaos at 7:15 the following morning. Commissioner Daniels had called an emergency meeting of all precinct captains, internal affairs investigators, and the department's legal team. Their faces reflected a mixture of shock, anger, and fear as the security footage played on the conference room's main screen. "Play it again," Daniels ordered, his complexion ashen. "And someone tell me how the hell Officer Mercer's face is plastered." Across CNN, destroying the FBI director's car. The footage replayed in excruciating detail. Richard Mercer's hate-filled expression was unmistakable as he methodically vandalized the Mercedes, the slurs he spray-painted clearly visible, despite the network's attempt to blur them for public broadcast. "Jesus Christ," muttered Captain Bradshaw, who had protected Mercer for years. "Tell me that's not a department-issued phone in his hand." "It is," confirmed the head of Internal Affairs, Sandra Washington. "And the GPS data confirms it was at the restaurant at exactly that time." Commissioner Daniels slammed his hand on the conference table. "I want Mercer suspended immediately. Badge and gun surrendered within the hour." "Sir," Bradshaw interjected, "shouldn't we first get his side of the story? The police union can go to hell," Daniels snapped. "Do you have any idea what we're dealing with here? That's not just any federal employee's car. That's Elijah Wright's vehicle, the first black FBI director in American history, appointed by the president himself, a man with a direct line to the attorney general." "But still," Bradshaw persisted, "there must be some explanation." Sandra Washington interrupted. sliding a folder across the table. "There's more. We pulled Mercer's record as soon as we identified him. 12 excessive force complaints in 15 years, all against black civilians. All dismissed." "Why am I just hearing about this now?" Daniels demanded. Washington's eyes flicked briefly toward Bradshaw. "There appears to have been intervention from supervisory personnel in several cases." The room fell silent as Daniels processed this information. "Who signed off on dismissing these complaints?" No one spoke for several seconds, until Washington finally answered. "Captain Bradshaw handled most of them personally, sir." All eyes turned to Bradshaw, whose face had gone from ashen to crimson. "They were meritless complaints. Every officer gets them." "Every officer gets 12 complaints for beating the same demographic?" Washington asked pointedly. Before Bradshaw could respond, the commissioner's assistant entered the room. "Sir, Director Wright is on line 1. The tension in the room doubled instantly. Daniels took a deep breath before pressing the speaker button on the conference phone. "Director Wright, this is Commissioner Daniels with my command staff. Let me begin by saying how deeply—" "Save the apologies, Commissioner," Wright's calm voice interrupted. "I'm not interested in words at this moment. I'm interested in actions." "Yes, sir. We're already moving to suspend Officer Mercer pending termination proceedings." "That's a start," Wright acknowledged. "But I'm more concerned about why an officer with Mercer's apparent history was still carrying a badge at all." Bradshaw shifted, uncomfortably in his seat as Wright continued. "My team has obtained records of 12 separate excessive force complaints against Mercer over his career, all filed by black citizens, all dismissed without proper investigation. Care to explain that pattern, Commissioner?" Daniels glared at Bradshaw. "We're investigating that inconsistency as we speak, Director." "Good," Wright replied. "Because this isn't just about one officer's actions last night. This is about systemic failures within your department that allowed someone like Mercer to operate with impunity for 15 years. "What are you asking for, Director?" Daniels asked cautiously. "I'm not asking for anything, Commissioner. I'm informing you that the FBI will be opening an investigation into pattern and practice violations within your department, with special attention to racial bias in policing and internal accountability systems." The room went completely silent. A pattern and practice investigation had the power to place the entire Boston Police Department under federal oversight for years. "Is that really necessary, Director?" Daniels finally asked. "We're prepared to handle Mercer's case with the utmost seriousness." "This isn't personal," Wright stated. "I want this handled exactly as it would be if I weren't the victim. No special treatment, no expedited process, but also no sweeping it under the rug. Standard procedure, by the book." After Wright disconnected, Daniels turned to his staff. "You heard the man. I want Mercer brought in now." 2 hours later, officers located Mercer at his apartment in South Boston. He surrendered his badge and gun without resistance, but maintained an expression of contempt throughout the process. "This is all politics," he told the officers who came to collect him. "They're throwing me under the bus because some affirmative action director got his feelings hurt." Meanwhile, FBI agents arrived with a warrant to search Mercer's residence. What they found disturbed even veteran agents: a collection of racist memorabilia hidden in a locked closet, including Klan literature, Confederate flags, and detailed journals documenting his encounters with black civilians, including those never officially reported. Most damning was a laptop containing evidence of Mercer's involvement with an online group called Blue Purity, where officers from departments nationwide shared racist content and coordinated harassment of minorities in white neighborhoods. His username, Writing America, had posted over 3,000 messages in the past 5 years. As agents boxed up evidence, one discovered a folder containing surveillance photos of black residents in affluent Boston neighborhoods, including personal information Mercer could only have obtained through police databases. Many of these individuals had subsequently been subject to traffic stops, searches, or arrests by Mercer, often on dubious grounds that were later dismissed in court. Across town, journalist Ayanna Johnson of the Boston Globe received an anonymous email from someone claiming to be a former colleague of Mercer's. The email contained digitized copies of complaints filed against Mercer that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. Johnson began contacting the complainants, uncovering a pattern of racial targeting and brutality spanning Mercer's entire career. By evening, the story had exploded nationally. News helicopters hovered above police headquarters as Mercer was escorted inside for questioning. Social media erupted with hashtags demanding justice, while conservative commentators rushed to characterize the incident as an isolated case being weaponized against law enforcement. Inside an interrogation room, Mercer sat stone-faced across from internal affairs investigators. His police union lawyer advised him to remain silent, but Mercer's confidence remained unshaken. "This will blow over," he whispered to his attorney. "It always does. They need guys like me on the street." His attorney didn't share his optimism. "Richard, this isn't like before. This is the FBI director we're talking about." Mercer scoffed. "Exactly. It's political. They'll transfer me to administrative duty for a few months, then quietly reinstate me when the media moves on to something else. Trust me, the system protects its own." But as he left the interrogation room, Mercer noticed something different in his colleagues' eyes. Not the usual solidarity he expected, but distance, avoidance. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. That night, Director Wright held a brief press conference from the FBI's Boston field office. Rather than focusing on his personal experience, he spoke broadly about the justice system. "What happened to my vehicle is unfortunate, but ultimately insignificant," he stated calmly. "What matters is not the damage to my car, but the damage done to public trust when those sworn to protect and serve instead target citizens based on race. This case will be handled like any other, no better, no worse. Because equal justice under law is not just a phrase carved on the Supreme Court building, it's the bedrock principle of our entire system." As Wright spoke, federal agents were discovering increasingly disturbing connections between Mercer and a network of officers across multiple departments who shared his racist ideology. What had begun as a case of vandalism was rapidly expanding into one of the largest police corruption investigations in recent history. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character is suddenly exposed for all to see? The revelation about Officer Richard Mercer's actions sent shockwaves through communities nationwide, triggering responses that revealed America's deep divisions about race and policing. If you believe police departments should immediately terminate officers who demonstrate racial bias, comment number 1 below. If you think there should be a careful investigation before any action is taken, comment number 2. And if you're shocked that such blatant racism could exist within modern law enforcement, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that expose injustice. What happens when a society is confronted with undeniable evidence of the racism many had claimed was exaggerated or a thing of the past? Let's continue this troubling story. The security footage showing Officer Mercer vandalizing Director Wright's car leaked online 48 hours after the incident. The Boston Police Department had intended to keep it as evidence, but someone within the department, identity still unknown, uploaded it to multiple social media platforms simultaneously. Within 3 hours, the video had been viewed 27 million times. The footage was devastating in its clarity. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretations. Mercer's face displayed unmistakable hatred as he spray-painted racial slurs across the luxury vehicle, his police badge clearly visible on his belt. Conservative media outlets that had initially defended Mercer fell silent as the video circulated, their initial claims about rush to judgment suddenly indefensible. In Roxbury, Boston's historically black neighborhood, community organizer Desiree Jackson watched the footage with a bitter sense of validation. "This is what we've been trying to tell you for decades," she told a crowd gathered at Greater Faith Baptist Church. "This isn't about one bad apple. This is about a system that attracts, protects, and promotes people who think like Mercer." Jackson had personal experience with Mercer. 8 years earlier, her 17-year-old son had been arrested by Mercer for matching the description of a robbery suspect, despite being 5 inches shorter and wearing completely different clothing than the actual perpetrator. Her son had spent 3 nights in jail before the charges were dropped without apology. Her complaint against Mercer had disappeared into the bureaucratic void. Today, I'm announcing the formation of the Accountability Coalition, Jackson continued. We will identify every person Mercer has arrested, detained, or interacted with during his 15 years with the department. We will review every case, file new complaints where appropriate, and demand justice for those wrongly targeted. Pre-wow. Sunset, the coalition had identified 23 individuals willing to publicly share their experiences with Mercer. They gathered on the steps of Boston Police Headquarters, each holding a sign with the date of their encounter and a brief description of Mercer's actions. Marcus Williams. Tased for asking why I was being stopped, 2014. Shanice Porter. Called. Racial slurs during traffic stop, 2017. James Tompkins. Planted drugs in my car after I filed a complaint, 2019. The demonstration remained peaceful, but produced powerful imagery that dominated evening newscasts. Police established a perimeter, but made no attempt to disperse the gathering, aware that the world was watching how they responded. Meanwhile, Mercer had gone into hiding at his sister's lake house in New Hampshire. He refused to speak with reporters, but maintained an active presence in conservative online forums, where he portrayed himself as a victim of cancel culture and political correctness gone mad. I'm being sacrificed on the altar of wokeness, he wrote in one post. 20 years serving my community, putting my life on the line every day, and this is the thanks I get. They're coming for all of us who still believe in traditional values. His supporters launched a GoFundMe for his legal defense, which raised $38,000 before the platform removed it for violating their terms of service regarding hate speech and criminal defense fundraising. Back in Boston, internal documents began leaking from the police department, revealing how Mercer's behavior had been repeatedly excused or minimized by supervisors. An email from Captain Bradshaw to a former commissioner, dated 3 years earlier, referred to complaints against Mercer as the usual grievances from people who don't respect authority, and recommended dismissal without investigation. The Boston Police Department faced unprecedented scrutiny, as journalists filed records requests for every complaint against officers over the past decade. Analysis revealed that complaints filed by Black residents were 87% less likely to result in disciplinary action than those filed by white residents, even when the allegations and evidence were similar. Social media investigators uncovered Mercer's online activities under various pseudonyms, including posts advocating violence against minorities and elected officials. One particularly disturbing thread discussed strategies for targeting Black motorists for pretextual stops in wealthy neighborhoods, with advice on how to find something if the initial search came up empty. The revelation that wasn't just Mercer, but a network of like-minded officers prompted 4 of Mercer's former colleagues to come forward anonymously, providing internal affairs with information about officers who shared Mercer's views and tactics. One described witnessing Mercer plant evidence on a Black suspect, while another officer deliberately stood blocking the patrol car's dashboard camera. I wanted to report it at the time, the officer told investigators, but I saw what happened to Rodriguez when he reported Mitchell for similar behavior last year. He was assigned to the worst shifts, denied backup when he called for assistance, and eventually forced to resign. The message was clear: keep your mouth shut. 7 days after the incident, Boston's mayor and police commissioner held a joint press conference, officially apologizing to Director Wright and pledging comprehensive reforms. The commissioner announced the formation of a special task force to review all of Mercer's arrests and cases, as well as those of officers closely associated with him. This moment demands more than just removing one officer, Mayor Chen stated, firmly. It requires a fundamental reassessment of how we hire, train, supervise, and hold accountable those who wear the badge. The days of looking the other way are over. Across the country, police departments issued statements condemning Mercer's actions and announcing reviews of their own anti-bias training and accountability systems. Police unions found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to defend officers' rights generally while distancing themselves from Mercer specifically. Director Wright maintained a deliberate distance from the public controversy, making only one additional statement. This case illustrates why body cameras, civilian oversight, and transparent disciplinary processes are not anti-police measures, but pro-justice measures. They protect good officers from false accusations and protect the public from those who abuse their authority. The national conversation grew increasingly heated. Conservative commentators who had initially defended Mercer pivoted to arguing that his case was being weaponized to malign all police officers. Liberal voices countered that the systemic protection Mercer had enjoyed for years proved the need for fundamental reform. In online forums frequented by police officers, opinions were divided. Some expressed shock and disgust at Mercer's actions, while others worried about a witch hunt that would prevent officers from effectively doing their jobs. A troubling number expressed support for Mercer's views, while criticizing only his carelessness in getting caught. 15 days after the incident, as public attention began to wane slightly, journalist Ayanna Johnson published her investigative piece in the Boston Globe. Titled, "The Protection Racket," it meticulously documented 27 cases where Mercer had abused his authority against black citizens, complete with testimony from victims, witnesses, and fellow officers. More disturbingly, it revealed the systematic way complaints had been buried, evidence misplaced, and whistleblowers silenced. Johnson's investigation revealed that Mercer's behavior was an open secret within certain precincts. Multiple officers admitted to hearing him use racial slurs during briefings, witnessed him falsifying reports, and observed him targeting black residents for harassment. Yet fear of retaliation kept them silent, creating what one officer called a blue wall of complicity. The article reignited public outrage, just as the FBI announced they were expanding their investigation to include potential civil rights violations by other officers within the department. What had begun as a single act of vandalism was evolving into one of the most significant police corruption cases in recent memory, and Richard Mercer, the man at the center of it all, was about to discover that the system he had counted on to protect him was rapidly crumbling around him. The Boston Federal Building hummed with activity as FBI teams established a command center dedicated to what agents now called Operation Clean Badge. Director Wright had officially recused himself from direct involvement in the case, appointing Deputy Director Marina Patel to lead the investigation. A 20-year Bureau veteran with a background in civil rights cases, Patel had built her reputation dismantling corrupt police networks in 3 major cities. "We need to approach this methodically," she told the assembled agents during their first briefing. "This isn't just about Mercer. The evidence suggests a coordinated group operating within multiple departments. Let's follow the data, build connections, and document everything meticulously." The investigation began with Mercer's digital footprint. Forensic analysts recovered deleted messages, mapped his connections, and tracked his activities across platforms. What emerged was disturbing. Mercer belonged to a private group called the Thin Blue Line Brotherhood, consisting of 37 officers from 12 different police departments across 3 states. The group used encrypted messaging to coordinate activities, share information about minority residents in predominantly white neighborhoods, and advise each other on how to target them without triggering oversight. Messages recovered from Mercer's devices revealed conversations about cleaning up neighborhoods by driving out minority homeowners through persistent harassment. Special Agent Marcus Cohen specialized in digital forensics and led the team examining Mercer's communications. "Look at this exchange from August last year," Cohen showed Patel, pointing to a message thread. "Mercer tells the group he's been tracking a black family that moved into Beacon Hill. He runs the husband's plates through the department database, finds a minor unpaid parking ticket from 3 years ago, and uses that as pretense to conduct a stop." The messages continued, with Mercer describing how he escalated the encounter, claiming to smell marijuana, forcing the man out of his car in front of his children, and conducting a humiliating search that yielded nothing. Fellow group members responded with congratulatory messages and racist jokes. "I'll keep the pressure on," Mercer had written. "They'll get the message eventually." The family had filed a complaint, but records showed Captain Bradshaw personally dismissed it without investigation. Further analysis of Mercer's emails revealed coordination with at least 5 other Boston officers to falsify reports, plant evidence, and harmonize testimony in cases involving minority suspects. In several instances, officers discussed sprinkling some crack on suspects who had committed no crimes but had disrespected them during encounters. While Wright had recused himself from operational aspects of the investigation, he received daily briefings on its progress. During one such meeting, He asked Patel a pointed question. How much of this activity was digital bragging versus actual criminal conduct? Patel's expression was grim. We're finding the digital communications were just the tip of the iceberg. Sir, we've begun cross-referencing their messages with body camera footage and arrest reports. The correlation is alarming. The team had discovered that Mercer routinely kept his body camera turned off during initial encounters with minority citizens, only activating it after situations escalated, often due to his own provocative behavior. However, cameras worn by other responding officers sometimes captured these interactions, creating inconsistencies in the record. In one particularly disturbing case from 2018, Mercer had arrested a black pre-med student for resisting arrest, despite there being no initial crime to justify the stop. Body camera footage from another officer arrived after Mercer had already physically subdued the student, showing the young man bloody and handcuffed. The official report claimed the student had attacked Mercer, but recovered text messages sent immediately after the incident told a different story. Had to teach an uppity med student some respect tonight, Mercer had written to Officer Gregory Sullivan. He questioned why I stopped him. Big mistake. Sullivan had replied, make sure. Your report says he swung first. Additional investigation revealed Mercer's abuse of police databases to conduct unauthorized searches on black residents in affluent neighborhoods. In the previous year alone, he had run background checks on 73 individuals without any legitimate law enforcement purpose. These searches correlated with patterns of traffic stops, many resulting in citations or arrests for minor infractions that were disproportionately pursued compared to similar violations by white residents. Financial investigation uncovered another disturbing pattern. Following several drug arrests where property was seized, deposits appeared in Mercer's personal accounts that couldn't be explained by his salary. The amounts weren't large enough to trigger automatic reporting. $2,000 here, $3,500 there. But over 5 years, they totaled more than $70,000. The investigation expanded to include Mercer's supervisors, particularly Captain Bradshaw, whose protection had enabled Mercer's conduct for years. Email records revealed Bradshaw had intervened in numerous complaints against Mercer, sometimes altering reports or losing key evidence. In exchange, Mercer had provided unspecified personal assistance to Bradshaw, including surveillance of Bradshaw's ex-wife during their contentious divorce proceedings. As federal agents dug deeper, the investigation broadened to include the department's entire complaint handling process. They discovered that complaints filed against officers were routinely categorized based on the race and socioeconomic status of the complainant, with those from minority or low-income citizens flagged as low priority, regardless of the severity of the allegations or quality of evidence. This isn't just individual racism, Patel told her team during a progress meeting. This is systematic suppression of accountability, deliberately structured to protect officers like Mercer. The uncovered evidence led to search warrants for 5 additional officers' homes and electronic devices. These searches yielded further connections, expanding the investigation to departments in neighboring communities where similar patterns emerged. Meanwhile, a separate team reviewed body camera footage from hundreds of Mercer's arrests over the years. They identified 43 cases where the footage contradicted written reports, 37 showing clear evidence of excessive force, and 12 where Mercer appeared to plant evidence during searches. The district attorney's office began reviewing all pending cases involving Mercer and officers connected to him, ultimately dismissing charges in 78 cases due to credibility concerns with the arresting officers. 4 months into the investigation, Deputy Director Patel briefed Wright on their progress. We've identified 23 officers across 4 departments directly involved in coordinated misconduct, she reported. Another 31 were aware of the activities but failed to report them, and 17 supervisory personnel actively protected the officers involved. Wright reviewed the summary document. And the scope of the misconduct? Extensive, Patel replied. Civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy, witness intimidation, unauthorized use of law enforcement databases, filing false reports, and those are just the federal charges. State prosecutors are preparing additional charges, including assault, battery, and malicious destruction of property. Wright nodded slowly. And Bradshaw? Central to the cover-up operation. We've documented 37 instances where he directly intervened to protect Mercer, and 16 others where he buried complaints against other officers in the network. Wright closed the file and looked up at Patel. When will you be ready to move? We can begin arrests next week. All documentation is in order, and the U.S. Attorney is prepared to present to the grand jury immediately. Good, Wright said. Proceed according to standard procedure. No one gets special treatment, either preferential or punitive, because of my involvement. This needs to be by the book from beginning to end. As Patel turned to leave, Wright added one final comment. Marina, make sure our house is in order too. I want a full review of how we interact with local departments. If this could happen in Boston, it could happen anywhere. And the FBI needs to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. The investigation had moved far beyond a single act of vandalism to expose a cancer within law enforcement that had metastasized for years. And Richard Mercer, who had spent his career targeting others, was about to become the target of one of the most comprehensive federal cases against police corruption in decades. Richard Mercer sat across from Clayton Phillips, the high-profile defense attorney he had retained, using the money his supporters had raised before the GoFundMe was shut down. Phillips' office on the 32nd floor of a downtown Boston skyscraper offered panoramic views of the harbor, a stark contrast to the basement apartment where Mercer now lived after his sister asked him to leave her lake house. They've got the video, Richard, Phillips said, leaning back in his leather chair. The spray paint on your hands, the racist memorabilia from your apartment, your online history, text messages coordinating harassment with other officers, and now they've tied you to unexplained deposits following seizures. I need something to work with here. Mercer's eyes narrowed. What about PTSD? I did 2 tours in Iraq before joining the force. Saw some heavy combat. Maybe I've got, what do they call it? Implicit bias from my experiences there. Phillips considered this. It's an angle. Not great, given the evidence of long-term patterns, but better than nothing. We could argue diminished capacity, psychological trauma, that was left untreated by the department despite clear warning signs. So I'm crazy, not racist? Mercer asked, a slight smile forming. Traumatized, not crazy, Phillips corrected. And we don't admit to anything explicitly racist. We just suggest that your experiences left you with hypervigilance and threat assessment, issues that manifested in troubling ways. Mercer nodded, satisfied. That could work. What about the FBI director angle? Can we make this about politics? Claim they're making an example of me because of who the car belonged to? Phillips's expression turned serious. Richard, I need you to understand something. Every defense strategy I'm considering is about damage control. The evidence against you is overwhelming. We're talking mitigation, not exoneration. That's defeatist thinking, Mercer scoffed. I've seen worse cases beat. Remember Officer Rankin who shot that kid? He walked. Different circumstances, different evidence, Phillips replied. And to be blunt, the political winds have shifted. Departments are under pressure. They need sacrificial lambs, and you've made yourself the perfect candidate. As they strategized, Phillips's assistant entered the office. Sir, you need to see this immediately. She handed him a tablet displaying a breaking news story. Phillips read it, his expression darkening. What is it? Mercer asked. Someone from your defense team has leaked information attempting to smear Director Wright, claiming he has anger issues and has made anti-police statements in private. The story includes alleged quotes from former colleagues. Mercer leaned forward. That's good, right? Undermines his credibility? Phillips slammed the tablet down. No, Richard, it's a disaster. First, it's clearly false and easily disproven. Wright has an impeccable reputation with commendations from police organizations throughout his career. Second, it makes you look desperate and vindictive. And third, he paused. It's already backfiring spectacularly. The news report continued, showing side-by-side comparisons of Wright's distinguished 30-year career in law enforcement versus Mercer's history of complaints and misconduct. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Wright had risen through the ranks based on merit and results, while Mercer had been repeatedly protected despite clear evidence of bias and abuse. The smear attempt has actually elevated Wright's public profile, Phillips explained. People are learning about his prosecution record, his work reforming police departments in 3 cities, and his reputation for fairness and integrity. Meanwhile, journalists are digging deeper into your background, and what they're finding isn't pretty. As if on cue, Phillips' phone rang. He answered, listened briefly, then placed it on speaker. "Richard, it's Caroline. I've filed for divorce," said the voice of Mercer's wife. "I've taken the kids to my sister's. The FBI showed me everything, Richard. The online posts, the text messages, the photos you took of black families in our neighborhood. How could you?" "Caroline, wait," Mercer began, but the line went dead. Phillips watched as the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate Mercer's confidence. "This isn't just about your career anymore, Richard. This is about your entire life." In the days that followed, Mercer's world continued to collapse. Former friends and colleagues publicly distanced themselves. The few who initially defended him went silent as more evidence emerged. His police union, which had initially promised to fight for him, issued a statement condemning racism in law enforcement and announcing an internal review of their defense policies for officers accused of misconduct. Desperate to control the narrative, Mercer agreed to an interview with National Voice, a conservative news outlet known for its pro-police stance. The interviewer, veteran journalist Calvin Brooks, had promised a fair hearing and chance to tell your side. "Officer Mercer, many Americans are troubled by the video showing you vandalizing Director Wright's vehicle," Brooks began. "What would you like to say to them?" Mercer had rehearsed his response carefully. "I want to be clear that I respect the law and have dedicated my life to protecting all citizens. What happened that night was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect my 15 years of service." "But what about the racist slurs you spray-painted on the vehicle?" Brooks pressed. "I was under tremendous stress," Mercer replied. "As I mentioned, my military service left scars that—" Brooks interrupted. "But the investigation has uncovered text messages spanning years, showing consistent use of those same slurs when referring to black citizens. That suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident." Mercer's prepared responses began to falter. "The messages are being taken out of context. Among officers, there's a certain gallows humor that civilians might not understand." "Is it humor to write, and I'm quoting directly from messages recovered from your phone, need to keep pushing until they move back where they belong?" Brooks asked. "That was regarding a black family who had moved into Beacon Hill, correct?" Mercer's facade cracked further. "Look, neighborhoods have certain characters, certain standards. It's not about race, it's about culture and values and—" "Property values?" Brooks finished for him. "Yes, exactly," Mercer agreed, not recognizing the trap. "When certain elements move in, property values decline. That's just reality." "And by certain elements, you mean black homeowners?" Brooks asked directly. "I didn't say that," Mercer protested, but his expression told a different story. By the time the 20-minute interview concluded, Mercer had managed to confirm nearly every allegation against him while attempting to defend himself. His thinly veiled racism was evident in every explanation, every justification. Even National Voice, which had intended to provide a sympathetic platform, distanced itself from his comments in the post-interview analysis. The following morning, prosecutors offered Mercer a plea deal: provide complete information about other corrupt officers in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The deal would still include significant prison time, but offered the possibility of eventual parole. Phillips strongly advised taking the deal. "The evidence is overwhelming, Richard. If this goes to trial, you're looking at 15 to 20 years. The plea could get that down to 8 with possibility of parole after 5. And turn rat?" Mercer spat. "Betray my brothers? No way. Besides, this is all political theater. When it actually gets to trial, no jury is going to convict a decorated officer for some property damage. This isn't just about property damage anymore," Phillips explained for what felt like the 100th time. "It's about civil rights violations, conspiracy, evidence tampering, unauthorized use of law enforcement databases, and potentially RICO charges if they can prove the coordination with officers in other departments." Mercer remained unmoved. "I'll take my chances with the jury. Americans still respect the badge. As Phillips had feared, the police union officially withdrew its support from Mercer's case the following day. The president of the Boston Police Benevolent Association made the announcement at a press conference. After reviewing the evidence, we have determined that Officer Mercer's actions are incompatible with our values and the oath we all took to protect and serve all citizens equally, he stated. His behavior has damaged public trust in police and made the job more dangerous for good officers who serve with honor. The abandonment by the union was a crushing blow to Mercer's defense, both practically and psychologically. Without union resources, he would struggle to afford continued legal representation. More significantly, it shattered his belief that the Brotherhood would protect him regardless of his actions. As his support system collapsed around him, prosecutors prepared to present their case to a grand jury, confident that the mountain of evidence would result in a comprehensive indictment. What had begun with a hateful act of vandalism was about to become one of the most significant police corruption trials in recent memory. Would you stand with a friend if evidence proved they had committed terrible acts of racial hatred? The trial of Richard Mercer forced many in law enforcement to confront this difficult question. If you believe the blue wall of silence protects corrupt officers and should be dismantled, comment number 1 below. If you think loyalty among officers is necessary for effective policing, comment number 2. And if this story has opened your eyes to how systemic racism can persist in modern institutions, hit that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening content. How does a society balance the presumption of innocence with overwhelming evidence of guilt? Let's continue with Mercer's day of reckoning. The federal courthouse in Boston was surrounded by barricades and security personnel as Richard Mercer's trial began on a crisp October morning. Protesters and counter-protesters gathered in designated areas, their competing chants creating a discordant soundtrack to the day's proceedings. National media had descended on the city, with networks establishing temporary studios in nearby buildings to provide continuous coverage. Inside Courtroom 3, U.S. District Judge Eleanor Harrington addressed the crowded gallery before jury selection began. "Let me be clear," she stated, her voice firm. "This court will not be influenced by public opinion, media coverage, or political pressure from any direction. We will follow the law and the evidence, nothing more and nothing less." Judge Harrington had been appointed by a conservative president 15 years earlier and had a reputation for strict adherence to procedural rules and impartiality. Both prosecution and defense had researched her extensively, finding little to suggest which way she might lean in this politically charged case. Jury selection proved challenging, requiring 3 days to seat 12 jurors and 4 alternates. Many potential jurors had already formed strong opinions based on media coverage, while others admitted personal biases about law enforcement or racial issues that disqualified them from service. The final jury comprised 7 women and 5 men from diverse racial and professional backgrounds. Assistant U.S. Attorney Vanessa Rodriguez led the prosecution team, while Clayton Phillips continued to represent Mercer, despite reported issues with payment for his services. FBI Director Wright was notably absent from the proceedings, adhering to his recusal from the case. Rodriguez's opening statement was clinical and methodical, laying out the timeline of events and previewing the evidence the government would present. "This case is about abuse of power," she told the jury. "It begins with a single act of hatred and vandalism, but the evidence will show this was merely the visible symptom of a much deeper corruption. Mr. Mercer didn't just commit a crime against Director Wright. He committed crimes against hundreds of citizens over 15 years while wearing a badge that was supposed to represent justice and protection." Phillips's opening statement emphasized Mercer's military service and the stresses of police work. "Officer Mercer served this country honorably in Iraq before protecting the streets of Boston," he began. "Like many who serve, he brought home invisible scars. The prosecution wants to paint a simplistic picture of hatred, but the reality is more complex. We'll show how the department failed to provide adequate psychological support for officers experiencing trauma and stress." As the trial proceeded, the prosecution methodically presented its case, beginning with the security footage of Mercer vandalizing Wright's car. The crystal-clear video left little doubt about his actions or the racial slurs he had spray-painted. The valet, Miguel, testified about witnessing the vandalism and recognizing Mercer as a police officer. He seemed pleased with what he was doing, Miguel testified, like he was enjoying it. The prosecution then expanded beyond the initial incident, calling victims of Mercer's past racial profiling to testify. Their stories created a devastating pattern of abuse spanning years. Jamal Washington described being stopped by Mercer while driving his new Mercedes through Beacon Hill. He asked how I could afford the car before even asking for my license. When I said I was a neurosurgeon at Massachusetts General, he made me get out of the car, handcuffed me, and searched the vehicle, claiming he smelled marijuana. He found nothing but kept me handcuffed for 45 minutes. Aisha Coleman testified about Mercer targeting her teenage sons repeatedly in their own neighborhood. He would park outside our house and follow my boys whenever they left. He stopped and searched them 11 times in 2 months. They were honor students, but he kept telling them he knew they were up to no good. Marcus Jefferson, a real estate developer, described how Mercer had disrupted an open house he was hosting in a predominantly white neighborhood. He came in claiming there had been burglary reports, questioned me in front of potential buyers, and effectively killed any chance of selling the property that day. When I filed a complaint, nothing happened. The prosecution supplemented these testimonies with statistical evidence from Dr. Rachel Winters, a criminologist who had analyzed Mercer's arrest and stop records. Officer Mercer stopped black citizens at a rate 8 times higher than statistical norms would predict based on the demographic makeup of his patrol areas, Dr. Winters testified. Moreover, he was 23 times more likely to conduct searches of black motorists than white motorists in identical situations. Digital forensic experts presented Mercer's text messages, social media posts, and participation in racist online forums. The evidence was damning. Mercer had repeatedly expressed violent racial animus and coordinated harassment with other officers targeting minority residents in predominantly white neighborhoods. Former colleagues reluctantly testified about Mercer's behavior, many admitting they had witnessed misconduct but feared reporting it. Officer Sarah Chen described an incident where Mercer had planted evidence on a black suspect. He called it sprinkling fairy dust, she testified, her voice barely audible. He kept a small bag of drugs in his pocket specifically for this purpose. When I questioned it, he said it was fine because these people are all guilty of something. The defense struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Phillips attempted to focus on Mercer's military service and alleged PTSD, but cross-examination revealed Mercer had never sought treatment or even claimed to suffer from trauma until after his arrest. Expert witnesses for the defense argued about implicit bias versus explicit racism, suggesting Mercer's actions reflected unconscious associations rather than deliberate hatred. This line of argument collapsed when prosecutors presented Mercer's private messages explicitly stating his intent to drive black residents out of certain neighborhoods. As the prosecution's case neared completion, Phillips made a desperate attempt to persuade Mercer not to testify. "The evidence is bad, Richard, but you taking the stand could be catastrophic," he advised during a break. "The prosecutor will tear you apart on cross-examination." "The jury needs to hear from me," Mercer insisted. "I can explain my side." "Your side includes text messages where you literally wrote, 'keeping the neighborhood pure after harassing a black family until they moved,'" Phillips responded. "How exactly do you plan to explain that?" Despite his attorney's objections, Mercer took the stand on the trial's 11th day. Initially, he appeared confident, maintaining the facade of a dedicated officer who had perhaps made a single mistake. In a moment of weakness, Rodriguez's cross-examination systematically dismantled this portrayal. "Mr. Mercer, you testified that vandalizing Director Wright's car was an isolated incident, correct?" she began. "Yes, I made a mistake that night," Mercer replied. "Yet we've seen evidence of you using the exact same racial slurs in text messages dating back 7 years. Were those also isolated incidents?" "Private communications can be misinterpreted," Mercer deflected. Rodriguez displayed one of his messages on the courtroom screen. "Is there a way to misinterpret your statement here that, and I quote, 'these animals don't belong in decent neighborhoods'?" As cross-examination continued, Mercer's composure cracked. His answers became increasingly defensive and contradictory. When cornered about inconsistencies between his testimony and documented evidence, he claimed conspiracies against him, media bias, and political persecution. The turning point came when Rodriguez questioned him about specific victims. "Do you remember Elijah Turner, the 16-year-old honor student you arrested for matching the description of a robbery suspect?" "Vaguely," Mercer replied cautiously. "The robbery suspect was described as 6 feet tall with dreadlocks. Mr. Turner was 5'7" with a close-cropped haircut. Can you explain why you believed he matched the description?" "It was dark. I made a good faith mistake." Rodriguez displayed Mercer's text message sent immediately after the arrest. "Got another one off the street. One less future thug to worry about." "Was that also a good faith mistake, Mr. Mercer?" As questioning continued, Mercer's thinly veiled contempt became increasingly evident. His responses grew more hostile, revealing the very prejudice he was denying. Several jurors visibly recoiled when, under particularly intense questioning, he snapped, "You people always stick together," apparently forgetting where he was and who was listening. By the time he left the stand, Mercer had effectively confirmed the prosecution's portrayal of him as a vengeful racist who had abused his authority for years. The jury's expressions told the story. His testimony had been catastrophic for his defense. In closing arguments, Rodriguez methodically summarized the evidence, connecting Mercer's vandalism of Wright's car to his long history of racial targeting and abuse of power. "This case began with a hate crime against a federal official," she concluded. "But the evidence has revealed something far more insidious, a 15-year campaign of targeted harassment against citizens based solely on their race, carried out under the color of law and protected by a system designed to shield officers like Mr. Mercer from accountability." Phillips's closing argument attempted to separate Mercer's personal failings from his record as an officer with numerous arrests and commendations. "We ask that you consider the totality of Richard Mercer's service, not just his worst moments," Phillips urged the jury. "Law enforcement is a difficult job that few are willing to undertake. If we demand perfection from those who protect us, we will have no one left to wear the badge." Judge Harrington delivered detailed instructions to the jury, emphasizing that they must consider each charge separately and apply the legal standards of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, few in the courtroom expected them to take long. They didn't. After just 4 hours, remarkably brief for such a complex case, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict on all counts. While Richard Mercer's fate was being decided by 12 citizens in a Boston courtroom, the implications of his case were reverberating through law enforcement agencies nationwide. FBI Director Elijah Wright, still formally recused from the Mercer investigation, had been using the spotlight on police misconduct to implement long overdue reforms in how federal agencies interacted with local departments. In a conference room at FBI headquarters in Washington, Wright addressed the heads of all 56 field offices via secure video link. "The Mercer case has exposed critical vulnerabilities in how we vet and oversee our local law enforcement partners," Wright explained. "Effective immediately, we're implementing new protocols for joint task forces and information sharing. The new guidelines required enhanced background checks for local officers assigned to federal task forces, including review of complaint histories and social media screening. Additionally, the FBI would establish confidential reporting channels for officers to flag concerning behavior by colleagues without risking retaliation. We cannot be effective if we turn a blind eye to misconduct simply because it occurs behind a badge," Wright continued. "Public trust is not just a nice-to-have. It's essential to our mission. When communities don't trust law enforcement, they don't report crimes, they don't share information, and they don't cooperate with investigations." Across the country, police departments were conducting their own internal reviews, motivated by fear of becoming the next Boston PD. In Chicago, the superintendent ordered a comprehensive audit of all officers with multiple complaints. In Los Angeles, the police commission implemented mandatory review of body camera footage from officers with patterns of racial disparities in stops and arrests. In Atlanta, The department began requiring psychological evaluations for officers every 3 years, rather than just at hiring. These changes weren't universally welcomed. Police unions in several cities resisted new oversight measures, arguing they would hamper officers' ability to do their jobs effectively. Conservative commentators warned about reduced policing in high-crime areas if officers feared scrutiny of legitimate law enforcement actions. Yet in Boston itself, change was coming from within the department. A group of reform-minded officers, led by Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez, had created an anonymous reporting system called Shield of Integrity that allowed officers to flag problematic behavior without fear of retaliation. "We're tired of the Mercers of the world making us all look bad," Rodriguez told reporters. "The vast majority of officers want to serve with honor and see accountability for those who don't. The old code of silence doesn't protect good cops. It only protects bad ones." The system had already led to investigations of several officers, identified in the FBI probe as associated with Mercer. 2 had resigned rather than face internal affairs investigations, while 3 others were on administrative leave pending review of their conduct. Captain Bradshaw, Mercer's longtime protector, had been suspended after emails revealed his systematic burial of complaints against officers under his command. Subsequent investigation discovered he had maintained 2 separate filing systems. One official, one hidden, with the latter containing dozens of legitimate complaints that never received proper investigation. Meanwhile, the victims of Mercer's years of harassment and abuse had formed the Citizens Justice Coalition, advocating for review of all cases handled by officers with histories of racial bias. Led by Desiree Jackson, whose son had been wrongfully arrested by Mercer years earlier, the coalition had already identified 73 cases for potential review. "This isn't about attacking police," Jackson explained during a community meeting. "It's about ensuring equal justice. When officers target people based on race rather than behavior, innocent people suffer while real criminals go free. Nobody benefits from biased policing." The coalition had secured pro bono legal representation from the city's top law firms, creating teams to review cases, file appeals, and seek expungement of charges resulting from biased enforcement. Their work had already led to the overturning of 11 convictions based on evidence that had been planted or misrepresented by Mercer and his associates. On Capitol Hill, congressional hearings on qualified immunity and police accountability had been convened, with Wright among the expert witnesses testifying about necessary reforms. His testimony carefully balanced the need for officer protection when making good faith decisions with the importance of accountability for deliberate misconduct. The doctrine of qualified immunity was never intended to shield officers who deliberately violate constitutional rights, Wright testified. "We need a more nuanced approach that protects officers making split-second decisions in dangerous situations, while ensuring that those who abuse their authority face appropriate consequences." The Mercer case had created unlikely allies across political lines. Conservative lawmakers who traditionally supported law enforcement unequivocally had been disturbed by the evidence of systematic abuse and cover-up. Liberal advocates who typically criticized police practices acknowledged the importance of cooperation from within departments to identify and remove problematic officers. In Boston's Police Academy, Instructor Sergeant Michael Torres had completely revamped the ethics and bias awareness curriculum in response to the case. "We used to treat these as check-the-box requirements," he admitted. "Now we're having real conversations about power, responsibility, and the dangers of remaining silent when we see misconduct. We're using the Mercer case as a case study in how individual actions can undermine an entire department's legitimacy." New recruits were now required to study the patterns that allowed Mercer to operate unchecked for so long, with emphasis on the responsibility of officers to report concerning behavior by colleagues. Role-playing scenarios placed cadets in situations where they witnessed misconduct and had to decide how to respond. The most significant change came from an unexpected source. Police Commissioner Daniels, initially defensive about his department's failure to identify Mercer's behavior sooner, had embraced reform with surprising vigor after reviewing the full evidence. "I've been in law enforcement for 32 years, he stated during a department-wide address. "I believed we were one of the good departments. But the evidence from the Mercer case shows we had a cancer growing right under our noses, and our Systems were inadequate to detect it, much less remove it. Daniels implemented a comprehensive overhaul of the department's complaint processing, requiring all allegations of misconduct to be reviewed by a panel, including both internal affairs, investigators, and civilian oversight members. Additionally, he established a pattern analysis unit to identify officers accumulating multiple complaints, even if individual incidents were not sustained. One complaint might be a misunderstanding, he explained. 3 complaints might be bad luck. But when an officer accumulates a dozen complaints from different citizens over different incidents, that's a pattern we can no longer ignore, regardless of how well connected that officer might be. As these changes spread throughout the law enforcement community, Mercer himself waited in a holding cell at the federal courthouse, unaware of how his case had become a catalyst for the very reforms he would have despised. The jury had reached their verdict, and his future would soon be decided. The courtroom fell silent as Richard Mercer stood beside his attorney, facing Judge Harrington as the jury forewoman prepared to announce the verdict. After 11 days of testimony and just 4 hours of deliberation, the outcome seemed inevitable to most observers. On count 1, civil rights violations under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. Mercer's expression remained impassive as the forewoman continued. On count 2, destruction of government property, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, hate crime enhancements, we find the defendant guilty. The pattern continued through all 17 counts: conspiracy, witness intimidation, unauthorized use of law enforcement databases, filing false reports, evidence tampering. Guilty on every charge. Judge Harrington scheduled sentencing for 30 days later and ordered Mercer remanded to custody, denying bail based on flight risk and the severity of the convictions. As marshals led Mercer away, he maintained the rigid posture of a man still denying the reality of his situation. In the days following the verdict, additional victims came forward with stories of Mercer's abuse, creating an even more comprehensive picture of his 2-decade campaign of racial targeting. Diane Reynolds described how Mercer had followed her 16-year-old son home from school repeatedly, telling the teenager he was watching him and knew what he was up to. James Williams recounted being handcuffed and detained for an hour after Mercer spotted him jogging through Beacon Hill, claiming he matched a suspect description that later proved non-existent. Most disturbing was the testimony of Marie Baptiste, whose son Marcel had been arrested by Mercer for drug possession, despite having no criminal history or drugs on his person. Marcel had spent 8 months in jail awaiting trial before charges were finally dismissed. During that time, he lost his scholarship to Boston University, and his mother lost their apartment struggling to pay legal fees. 3 years later, Marcel died by suicide, his final note referencing the hopelessness he felt after his encounter with Mercer. "My son was never the same after Officer Mercer put those handcuffs on him," Baptiste told reporters outside the courthouse. "He took more than just my son's freedom that day. He took his sense of place in the world, his belief that he could succeed if he worked hard and followed the rules." These stories painted a devastating portrait of how a single biased officer could destroy lives, families, and communities through the systematic abuse of authority. Each account added to the growing pressure on Judge Harrington to impose the maximum possible sentence. However, even as public sentiment solidified against Mercer, resistance to the verdict emerged from corners of the law enforcement community. A group of officers still loyal to Mercer began a coordinated campaign of harassment against witnesses and reformers within the department. Lieutenant Rodriguez found her locker vandalized with the word "traitor" spray-painted across it. Officers who had testified against Mercer reported being denied backup when requesting assistance in potentially dangerous situations. Miguel, the valet whose video evidence had been crucial to the case, had his car windows smashed and a threatening note left on his windshield. FBI Director Wright himself became a target, receiving death threats and experiencing an attempted break-in at his home in Virginia. Security footage identified the would-be intruder as a former police officer who had been active in online forums supporting Mercer. The man was arrested before he could enter the property, found carrying a handgun and restraints. These acts of intimidation only hardened the resolve of those pushing for reform. Commissioner Daniels publicly denounced the harassment and announced that any officer found participating would be immediately terminated. He assigned personal protection to officers who had testified and installed additional security cameras throughout department facilities. The intimidation campaign backfired in another significant way. It provided powerful evidence of the toxic culture that had protected officers like Mercer. News coverage of the harassment bolstered public support for comprehensive police reform, with polls showing 73% of Boston residents favoring stronger oversight and accountability measures. On the day of sentencing, the courthouse was once again surrounded by security barriers and protesters. Inside, the gallery was packed with Mercer's victims, fellow officers, and media representatives. Director Wright was present for the first time during the proceedings, seated quietly in the back row. Judge Harrington began by addressing the numerous victim impact statements submitted to the court. "I have reviewed 68 statements from individuals directly harmed by Mr. Mercer's actions over his 15-year career," she stated. "These accounts describe not only individual instances of harassment, false arrest, and excessive force, but the cumulative effect of targeted policing on entire communities. Children who grew up afraid of law enforcement, families who moved from neighborhoods where they had every right to live, citizens who lost faith in the justice system meant to protect them." She then turned her attention to Mercer directly. "Mr. Mercer, in my 20 years on the federal bench, I have sentenced individuals for a wide range of offenses against society. But few crimes strike as deeply at the foundation of our constitutional order as those committed by officials entrusted with enforcing the law. You were given extraordinary power, the authority to detain, arrest, and use force against your fellow citizens. You abused that power not in isolated moments of poor judgment, but as part of a sustained campaign of targeted harassment based on racial animus." Judge Harrington was known as a judicial conservative, typically deferential to law enforcement in her rulings. This made her next words even more impactful. "The evidence presented at trial showed not a momentary lapse, but a career built on prejudice and abuse of authority. You used your badge not as a shield to protect communities, but as a weapon to terrorize citizens based solely on their race. In doing so, you violated not only the law, but the oath you swore to uphold the Constitution and serve all citizens equally." She continued, addressing the broader implications of the case. "This sentencing must send an unambiguous message. No one is above the law, particularly those entrusted with enforcing it. When officers like Mr. Mercer betray their oath, they do immeasurable harm not only to their victims, but to the vast majority of law enforcement officials who serve with honor and integrity." Judge Harrington then delivered her sentence: 15 years in federal prison without possibility of early parole, to be served at a facility outside New England to prevent potential favorable treatment from former colleagues. Additionally, Mercer would be permanently barred from any law enforcement or security position and required to pay restitution to his identified victims. The sentence was unprecedented for a police officer convicted of misconduct, nearly twice what prosecutors had expected based on similar cases. It reflected not just the vandalism that had begun the case, but the years of systematic civil rights violations uncovered during the investigation. As marshals prepared to lead Mercer from the courtroom, he turned toward the gallery where Director Wright sat and shouted a final racial slur, his face contorted with the same hatred visible in the security footage that had begun his downfall. The outburst only served to confirm the court's assessment of his unrepentant racism. Later that day, Commissioner Daniels announced a complete departmental overhaul, including mandatory anti-bias training, comprehensive review of all officers, social media and past complaints, and a new civilian oversight board with actual disciplinary authority. The police union, reading the political winds, issued a statement supporting the reforms while insisting they would work to ensure they were implemented fairly. As Mercer began his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Arizona, the department he had once represented was being transformed by the very exposure of the corruption he had embodied. His case had become both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for change, demonstrating both the damage one biased officer could inflict and the possibility of meaningful reform when institutions finally confronted the cancer within. 1 year after Richard Mercer's sentencing, Director Elijah Wright stood at the podium in Boston Police Headquarters' main conference room, surveying the transformed department. The physical space itself had been renovated, with walls removed, to create more transparent workspaces and community meeting areas added where citizens could interact with officers in non-enforcement contexts. A year ago, this department faced a crisis of legitimacy. Wright addressed the assembled officers and community leaders. Today, you're becoming a national model for what policing can and should be in the 21st century. The changes went far beyond physical renovations. Mercer's case had led to the conviction of 12 other officers for various offenses ranging from evidence tampering to civil rights violations. 23 additional officers had resigned rather than face investigation. The previous police commissioner had stepped down amid revelations that he had ignored early warnings about Mercer's conduct. Most significantly, Boston had implemented the nation's most comprehensive police accountability system, combining rigorous data tracking, body camera review, civilian oversight, and early intervention for officers showing concerning patterns of behavior. The reforms had initially been met with resistance, but the evidence uncovered in the Mercer investigation had made opposition politically untenable. The transformation we're witnessing isn't just about removing bad actors, Wright continued. It's about creating systems that prevent abuse in the first place and quickly identify it when it occurs. It's about changing a culture that too often prioritizes protecting officers over protecting the public they serve. The FBI had played a central role in this transformation, not through force, but through partnership. Wright had established a police integrity unit within the Bureau that provided technical assistance, training, and resources to departments implementing reforms. Rather than threatening federal intervention, the unit offered support for departments proactively addressing potential problems. The most tangible outcome of the Mercer case was the creation of a national database tracking officers with histories of misconduct who moved between departments. Previously, officers fired for cause could simply relocate to another jurisdiction, their disciplinary records often hidden from new employers. The new system, administered jointly by the FBI and Department of Justice, required departments to report terminations for misconduct and check the database before hiring. Officer mobility shouldn't mean accountability immunity, Wright explained. This system ensures that problems don't simply migrate from one community to another. In Boston specifically, the police department had undergone a dramatic diversification of leadership. The new commissioner, Gabriela Rodriguez, no relation to Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez, was the city's first Latina police leader. Her command staff reflected the city's demographic makeup, with key positions held by Black, Asian, and Hispanic officers, many promoted from within based on merit rather than connections. The victims of Mercer's years of abuse had received substantial settlements from the city, along with formal apologies and, in many cases, expungement of false charges. The Citizens Justice Coalition had expanded its work, reviewing cases from other biased officers and advocating for those wrongfully ensnared in the criminal justice system. Most poignantly, the coalition had established the Marcel Baptiste Scholarship, providing full university funding for students from communities historically targeted by biased policing. The first recipient was Jamal Washington Jr., whose father had been among Mercer's earliest victims. The ripple effects extended nationwide. Inspired by Boston's example and motivated by fear of similar scandals, legislatures in 27 states had passed laws mandating body cameras, civilian oversight, and transparency in police disciplinary proceedings. Federal legislation required departments receiving Justice Department funding to implement early warning systems to identify officers accumulating unusual patterns of complaints or use of force incidents. Throughout this period of transformation, Richard Mercer remained in federal prison, his appeals repeatedly denied by higher courts. He maintained his racism and showed no remorse, becoming increasingly isolated as even former supporters distanced themselves from his toxic legacy. 6 months into Mercer's sentence, Director Wright had made an unannounced visit to the Arizona Federal Correctional Facility where Mercer was housed. Not seeking revenge but closure, Wright had requested a brief meeting with the man whose hatred had inadvertently sparked significant positive change. The meeting occurred in a small interview room under careful supervision. Mercer had appeared surprised by the visit, his initial smugness giving way to visible discomfort as Wright calmly informed him of the reforms his actions had inspired. "I didn't come here to gloat," Wright had told him. "I came to thank you, in a way. Your hatred exposed problems that had festered for decades. Because of you, Thousands of officers who serve honorably now work in better departments, and millions of citizens receive more equitable policing. Mercer had responded with a stream of racial invective, threatening Wright, and promising retribution when he was released. The outburst was recorded by prison officials and resulted in an additional 2 years added to his sentence for threatening a federal official. Wright had left the facility unmoved by Mercer's continued hatred, more convinced than ever of the necessity of the reforms now sweeping through American law enforcement. 1 year after this visit, Wright attended the Police Academy graduation ceremony for the Boston Police Department's newest class of officers. Among the graduates was Jamal Washington, Jr., who had decided to follow in Director Wright's footsteps, rather than his original plan to become a doctor. "I wanted to be part of the solution," Washington explained after the ceremony. "Director Wright showed me that law enforcement can be a force for justice when good people step up and bad actors are held accountable." The graduating class reflected the new Boston Police Department, diverse in background, unified in commitment to constitutional policing and equal protection. Their training had included extensive study of the Mercer case, ensuring they understood both the damage caused by biased policing and the systems now in place to prevent its recurrence. As Wright shook hands with each graduate, he felt cautious optimism about the future of American policing. The transformation sparked by one hateful act had not solved all problems or healed all wounds, but it had created momentum for meaningful change. The work would continue long after Mercer was forgotten, carried forward by a new generation of officers committed to justice rather than power. In his address to the graduates, Wright summarized the lesson of the past year. True respect for the badge comes not from fear or intimidation, but from equal justice faithfully administered. Your authority derives not from your weapon or your power to arrest, but from the trust of the communities you serve. Guard that trust as your most precious resource, for once lost, it may take generations to rebuild. The graduates rose in standing ovation, joined by community members invited to witness this new beginning. Among them was Desiree Jackson, who had once feared police but now served on the Civilian Oversight Board. Beside her stood Miguel, the valet whose courage in recording Mercer's crime had helped spark the cascade of accountability. As the ceremony concluded, Wright stepped back to observe the mingling of new officers with the citizens they would serve. The distance that had once existed between police and many communities was gradually narrowing, replaced by cautious but genuine partnership. The transformation would require ongoing vigilance and commitment, but the foundation had been laid. What began with an act of hatred had culminated in structures of accountability that would long outlast both the perpetrator and his victims. In this way, justice had prevailed not just in Mercer's case, but in the system that had once protected him. This story illuminates how systemic racism persists when accountability fails and silence prevails. Richard Mercer's actions weren't simply those of one bad apple, but symptoms of institutional failure that enabled his behavior for years. True, change required more than removing one officer. It demanded transforming entire systems that protected wrongdoers through the blue wall of silence. The most powerful catalyst for change wasn't the crime itself, but the courage of individuals who risked everything by speaking truth to power. Miguel recording the evidence, officers breaking rank to testify, victims sharing their stories, and leaders like Wright using their authority to implement lasting reforms. Justice isn't passive. It requires active participation from everyone in the system. When we witness injustice but remain silent, we become complicit. The path forward demands both institutional reform and personal courage, creating systems where racial bias cannot hide behind a badge and where equal protection under law becomes reality rather than rhetoric. What have you witnessed that required speaking up, even when silence seemed safer? How did you respond? Comment below about a time when you chose courage over comfort in confronting injustice. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that confront uncomfortable truths, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of America's most challenging issues. Remember that in the fight against racism, silence is never neutral. It's a choice that shapes our collective future. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep speaking truth to power.